May 1943. The sun-scorched plains of Tunisia, the once feared Africa Corps, Rommel's desert lions, have been cornered. Their tanks are silent, their guns cold. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers lay down their arms. For many, the war feels over. But a journey unlike any other is just beginning. These men, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, braced for the worst. They expected brutal retribution, harsh labor, and miserable prison camps. Just as they'd seen depicted in their newsreel, they were Hitler's soldiers, after all, captured by their sworn enemies. As they were herded onto transport ships, the uncertainty was suffocating. The destination? A mystery. The only certainty was the vast, unforgiving ocean ahead. For weeks, they were packed into the holds of Liberty ships, crossing the Atlantic. The fear of U-boat attacks was constant, an ironic twist of fate. Then, one morning, a silhouette appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the bombed-out ruins of a European port. It was the skyline of New York City. The Statue of Liberty stood there, a silent, imposing figure. For these prisoners, it was a sight so alien, so powerful. It defied everything they'd been taught. From the docks, they were put on trains. And as the American landscape rolled by, their confusion deepened. They saw no signs of a nation crippled by war. Instead, they saw bustling cities, endless fields of healthy crops, and civilians who weren't starving or living in fear. They saw cars, lots of them, parked outside neat suburban houses. Where were the bread? Where was the despair the Führer had promised them was consuming America? The prisoners were headed to camps scattered across the United States, from Virginia to Texas, from Arizona to Wisconsin. When they arrived, another shock awaited them. These weren't the grim, barbed wire hellholes they had imagined. They were clean, organized, and, surprisingly, humane. The Geneva Convention was followed to the letter. They were given proper housing, medical care, and most shockingly of all, food. And the food, it was abundant. White bread, butter, meat, coffee with sugar, even ice cream and Coca-Cola. For soldiers who had spent months surviving on meager rations in the desert, this was unimaginable luxury. They ate better as prisoners in America than they had as soldiers in Hitler's army. Some men, who had never seen such plenty, would hoard bread under their pillows, unable to believe there would be more the next day. This simple act of providing plentiful, good food was a powerful psychological blow against the Nazi ideology they carried. But it wasn't just about food. The camps offered opportunities. Prisoners could work for petty cents, on farms or in factories, helping to fill the labor shortage left by American men who were fighting overseas. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and cut lumber in Minnesota. This work brought them into contact with ordinary Americans, and this is where the propaganda truly began to crumble. They met farmers, factory foremen, and townspeople. They expected hatred, but instead they often found curiosity, and sometimes even kindness. An American farmer might share his lunch with a German prisoner. A child might wave at the truck of post driving by. These small, human interactions were profoundly disorienting. These Americans weren't the degenerate, subhuman monsters from Goebbels' films. They were just ... people. Many prisoners were astonished by the freedom and casual confidence of Americans. They saw women driving cars and working jobs. They saw different races and ethnicities living side by side, something unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy of Nazi Germany. They were even allowed to subscribe to American newspapers and magazines. Reading about the progress of the war from the Allied perspective was a revelation. The steady stream of bad news for Germany, presented with facts and figures, was impossible to dismiss as mere propaganda. Inside the camps, the prisoners organized themselves. They formed orchestras, put on plays, and took classes offered by the camp authorities, ranging from English to engineering. Libraries were established, filled with books that had been banned in Germany for a decade. For the first time, many of these young men were exposed to ideas and literature free from state censorship. They were reading authors who had been burned in effigy back home. Of course, it wasn't a holiday. They were still prisoners, confined behind wire, their future uncertain. Hardcore Nazis within the camps tried to enforce party discipline, sometimes violently. They intimidated and even murdered fellow prisoners suspected of being anti-Nazi. The ideological battle that had torn Europe apart was now being fought on a smaller scale inside these American prison camps. But for a significant number, the experience was transformative. The combination of humane treatment, exposure to American life, and access to uncensored information chipped away at their indoctrination. They began to question everything they had fought and sacrificed for. They saw a country that was not only powerful and prosperous, but also, in its own imperfect way, fundamentally decent. This was a new kind of warfare, one not fought with bullets or bombs, but with bread, books, and basic human decency. The United States had unintentionally launched a massive denazification program years before the official one began. In Postwar Germany, these captured soldiers, sent to conquer, were instead being conquered by an idea of a world completely different from the one they had left behind. They arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich. How they would return, and what they would believe, was now an open question. Summer 1943. For thousands of young German soldiers, the war in North Africa was over. Captured by Allied forces, they faced an uncertain future. What awaited them? A brutal prison camp. Starvation. Starvation, the propaganda they'd been fed for years, painted a grim picture. But reality, as it often does, was about to shatter all their expectations. Their next journey wasn't to a desolate prison, but across the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean, towards the very heart of their enemy. America. The ships that carried them were not the cramped, hellish transports they might have imagined. These were Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied war effort, returning to the States after delivering supplies to Europe. For the German prisoners of war, this voyage became a surreal transition from the grit and grime of the battlefield to something utterly alien. Imagine being a soldier who, just weeks ago, was surviving on meager rations in the searing heat of the North African desert. Suddenly, you're on a ship, and you're being handed hot meals. Not just sustenance, but actual, proper food. 3 times a day. For many, it was the first time in months, even years, they had eaten so well. And it wasn't just the food. There was medical care. Wounds that had been crudely bandaged in the field were now cleaned and treated by trained medics. Sicknesses that had festered in the harsh conditions of war were finally addressed. This simple act of humane treatment was disorienting. They were the enemy, yet they were being cared for. The guards, mostly American GIs, were not the vengeful monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were professional, often relaxed, treating the prisoners with a surprising degree of decency. This wasn't what they were told to expect. This was something different. The days at sea stretched into weeks. The initial tension and fear among the prisoners began to melt away, replaced by a strange sense of calm. The endless blue of the Atlantic was a world away from the dust and death of the front lines. They were even given books to read, a simple luxury that felt like a treasure. For the first time since the war began, these young men had a moment to breathe, to think, to simply exist without the constant threat of death hanging over them. They'd look out at the ocean, the same one that separated them from their homes and families, and wonder what could possibly lie on the other side. Their entire worldview, carefully constructed by years of indoctrination, was beginning to crack. Then, one morning, a murmur rippled through the ship. Land had been sighted. As they drew closer, a shape began to form on the horizon. It grew larger, more defined, until it was unmistakable. It was a city, but not just any city. Towers of steel and glass pierced the sky, a man-made mountain range unlike anything they had ever seen. Lady Liberty stood guard at the harbor, a silent, colossal welcome. This was New York City. The Manhattan skyline. The prisoners crowded the decks, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and utter disbelief. They stared, speechless. This was America, the country that Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, had relentlessly portrayed as weak, decadent, and crumbling. Goebbels had told them America was a nation torn apart by strikes. starvation, and racial conflict. Its industry crippled. Its people demoralized. They were told that America was a hollow giant, ready to collapse at the slightest push. But the city before them was not crumbling. It was vibrant, powerful, and immense. The harbor was bustling with ships, a testament to an industrial might that was clearly not crippled. The sheer scale of the buildings, the energy emanating from the city, it was all a direct, visual contradiction to everything they had been brainwashed to believe. One former POW later recalled thinking, if they can build all this and still fight a war, we've already lost. The propaganda had lied. It was a stunning, disorienting realization. The America they were seeing with their own eyes was not the enemy from their posters and newsreels. It was a powerhouse, a land of impossible wealth and strength. As the ships docked, the next phase of their journey began. They were loaded onto trains, their windows blacked out for security. But the prisoners found ways to peek outside, and what they saw continued to chip away at their beliefs. They saw endless fields of corn, healthy livestock, and towns with well-dressed citizens. They saw something that had vanished from their own war-torn Germany. Abundance. People weren't starving. The country wasn't in chaos. In fact, life seemed normal. Shockingly normal. They saw teenagers driving cars, a luxury reserved for the elite back home. They saw grocery stores overflowing with food. These train journeys, which crisscrossed the country, were an education in themselves. The sheer size of America was overwhelming. 4 days they traveled, and still the landscape rolled on. It was a powerful, unspoken message about the nation's vast resources. For young men who came from a country obsessed with Lebensraum, or living space, the endless expanse of the American heartland was a humbling sight. They were being transported deep into the interior, to places with names they couldn't pronounce: Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Arizona. They were heading to the hundreds of POW camps that had been quietly constructed all across the United States. Upon arrival at these camps, the culture shock only intensified. The camps were not the barbed wire hellscapes they feared. They were orderly, clean, and surprisingly well equipped. They were given new clothes, proper barracks to live in, and access to canteens where they could buy extras like candy, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes with the small wages they earned from working. Yes, they were expected to work, often on local farms, helping to replace the American men who were away fighting. But this work was another source of shock. They were paid for their labor, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They interacted with American farmers and their families, who were often more curious than hostile. These daily interactions did more to denazify the prisoners than any formal program could have. They saw firsthand that Americans were not the monsters they'd been taught to hate. They were just people. They were hardworking, often friendly, and lived in a world of freedom and prosperity that was unimaginable back in Germany. The prisoners started learning English, playing sports like soccer and baseball, and even forming their own orchestras and theater groups. Inside the wire fences, a strange, parallel society emerged, a slice of America filtered through the eyes of its captives. Of course, it wasn't a holiday. They were still prisoners, separated from their loved ones, their futures uncertain. There were die-hard Nazis among them who clung to their ideology, who tried to enforce party discipline within the camps and dreamed of a final victory. But for the majority, the experience was transformative. The America they were living in was a stark contrast to the one they had been sent to fight. They were seeing the lie of the Third Reich unravel before their very eyes, not through Allied propaganda, but through their own lived experience. The sight of the Manhattan skyline was just the beginning. The real journey was the one happening inside their own minds, as they crossed the vast distance between Nazi ideology and American reality. This incredible, little-known chapter of World War II shows how truth can be a more powerful weapon than any gun. The journey of these POWs across the Atlantic and into the American heartland was more than just a transfer of prisoners. It was a collision of worlds, one that would change their lives forever. Imagine you're a German soldier captured in North Africa or on the battlefields of Europe. Your world has been reduced to the grim reality of war. Then, suddenly, you're shipped across the Atlantic to the one place your propaganda told you was a decadent, crumbling society. America, what you find there isn't what you are told. Instead of collapse, you see a nation humming with an unimaginable power. This is the story of nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war, and how their time in the United States shattered their entire worldview. Between 1943 and 1944, as the tide of war turned, America found itself with a new, unexpected population. German posts were dispersed across the country, housed in over 700 camps spread throughout 46 states. Far from being locked away in grim fortresses, many of these men were put to work, filling the labor gaps left by American GIs who were fighting overseas. This decision wasn't just about practicality. It became an unintentional, an incredibly powerful form of psychological warfare. For many of these prisoners, their first shock was the journey itself. They crossed the Atlantic, often on the same Liberty ships that had just delivered tanks and troops to Europe. They were then put on trains, and this is where the scale of America began to sink in. They traveled for days, seeing a landscape that just kept going. From the train windows, they saw endless fields of corn, wheat, and cotton, all meticulously cultivated and overflowing with abundance. They saw towns and cities that showed no signs of bombing, no rationing in the way they understood it, and a populace that seemed, frankly, well-fed and prosperous. The propaganda from Goebbels had painted a picture of an America on the verge of starvation, crippled by the Great Depression and internal strife. But the evidence before their own eyes told a completely different story. One German officer later wrote about his astonishment at seeing American civilians throwing away leftover food. For soldiers who had experienced the stringent rationing and hunger of wartime Germany, this casual abundance was simply it was the first crack in the foundation of their beliefs. When they arrived at their assigned camps, many were put to work on local farms. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and cut timber in the Pacific Northwest. They worked alongside American farmers, sometimes even eating meals with their families. This close contact with ordinary Americans was another revelation. They weren't the demonic, subhuman caricatures from the posters back home. They were just people hardworking, often friendly, and surprisingly unconcerned about the war in their day-to-day lives. This normalization of the enemy was profoundly disorienting, but the most staggering revelation was yet to come. While agricultural work showed them America's bounty, it was the industrial sector that revealed its true, terrifying might. Prisoners assigned to work in or near industrial centers like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago witnessed a spectacle of production that defied belief. They saw factories that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, their smokestacks painting the sky with the colors of industry. They saw assembly lines churning out Sherman tanks with an almost casual efficiency. They watched as B-24 Liberator bombers rolled out of the Fort Willow Run plant at a rate of 1 per hour. Imagine their perspective. Back in Germany, every tank, every plane, every ship was a monumental national effort, celebrated with newsreels and parades. Manufacturing was a constant struggle against Allied bombing and resource shortages. Here, in America, the production of war material seemed almost effortless, a byproduct of an economic engine so vast, so powerful, that it could wage a global war without its civilian population even feeling a significant pinch. One prisoner stationed near Detroit recounted how he and his comrades would simply stand and stare at the endless convoys of military vehicles rolling out of the factories. They tried to count them, but quickly lost track. The sheer volume was incomprehensible. They realized that America was producing more war material in a single month than Germany could possibly hope to produce in a year. The numbers were not just statistics on a page. They were a physical, tangible reality happening right before their eyes. This wasn't just about tanks and planes. It was about everything. It was about the quality of the steel, the endless supply of fuel, the mountains of tires, the literal rivers of molten metal being poured in foundries day and night. The myth of Allied weakness, a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda that had fueled the German war effort, was being systematically dismantled, not by words, but by the undeniable evidence of their own census. They weren't just prisoners of war. They were witnesses to the very force that was guaranteeing their country's defeat. The psychological impact was immense. Despair and disillusionment spread through the camps. How could Germany possibly win against this? The industrial power they were witnessing made a mockery of their Führer's promises of ultimate victory. They saw that the war was not a contest of will or ideology, but a brutal math problem of industrial output, and America had already solved the equation. This experience had a lasting effect. For many, it was the beginning of a denazification process that happened organically. Long before any formal re-education programs, they saw a different way of life, a different model of society. They saw a pluralistic nation where people from different backgrounds worked together. They saw a system that, for all its flaws, could generate a level of prosperity and power that was simply out of reach for their own totalitarian regime. When a visitor asked a group of German POs what they found most impressive about America, their answer wasn't the skyscrapers of New York or the vastness of the Grand Canyon. It was, as one man put it, the assembly lines. It was the relentless, overwhelming, awe-inspiring power of America's fields and factories. It was the quiet, humming certainty of a nation at work, a power that didn't need loud parades or bombastic speeches to prove its existence. It simply was. And for the men who saw it firsthand, that realization changed everything. They came to America as soldiers of the Third Reich, but many would leave with the core of their beliefs shattered, carrying with them the undeniable truth of a war that was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories and on the farms of their enemy. Imagine you're a German soldier, captured in North Africa in 1943. 4 years, you've been fed a constant diet of propaganda. America is a decadent, chaotic, and weak nation, a mongrel society on the brink of collapse. Its cities are crime-ridden jungles, its people are starving, and its industry is a joke. This is the truth you've been told, the truth you believe. Then, you find yourself on a train, crossing the very country you were taught to despise. But what you see through the window doesn't match the stories. You see vast, orderly farms stretching to the horizon, bursting with crops. You see towns with neat houses, cars parked in driveways, and children playing freely. There are no signs of the starvation or chaos you were promised. This is your first taste of cognitive dissonance, a crack in the foundation of your worldview. You arrive at a prisoner of war camp, maybe in Texas, or Wisconsin, or Arizona. You expect barbed wire, harsh guards, and meager rations. And yes, there's barbed wire. It's a prison camp, after all. But inside, things are different. The barracks are clean and well built. You're issued fresh clothes, sturdy boots, and given 3 meals a day. And the food. It's staggering. There's white bread, real butter, meat, coffee with sugar, and even ice cream on special occasions. You are getting more calories and better nutrition as a prisoner than you did as a soldier on the front lines. This is where the real battle begins. Not with guns, but in the minds of the prisoners. The camp becomes a microcosm of the ideological war. The diehard Nazis, the true believers, immediately sound the alarm. It's a trick. They hiss in the barracks at night. It's all for show. The Americans are trying to soften us, to break our spirit with luxury. They're putting on a performance for the Red Cross. To them, this abundance isn't a sign of American strength. It's a deceptive trap, a Potemkin village designed to fool them. They cling to their ideology, refusing to believe the evidence of their own eyes. They enforce discipline, hold secret meetings, and punish anyone who seems to be swayed by the American way. But for others, the seeds of doubt have been planted. These are the soldiers who were conscripted, the ones who fought for Germany but weren't necessarily married to the Nazi party line. They see the efficiency. They see the fairness. The American gods are firm, but generally not cruel. They are professional. The camp is run not with brutal force, but with a kind of organized, almost boring, competence. Then comes the most powerful weapon of all. The mail. Prisoners are allowed to write letters home. At first, the letters are cautious, filtered by camp censors and the ever-watchful eyes of the Nazi true believers. But slowly, the message starts to get through. A soldier writes to his wife, not about hardship, but about the incredible amount of food. He describes the canteen where prisoners can use the scrip they earn from working to buy cigarettes, chocolate, and Coca-Cola, a drink that was a symbol of American decadence. back home. Another writes to his parents about the vastness of the country he saw from the train. The endless fields of corn that seemed to defy the propaganda of a starving nation. These letters become artifacts of a changing perspective. One prisoner, a former mechanic, is assigned to work on a farm. He's astonished by the machinery. He writes about the tractors, the combines, the sheer level of mechanization that makes German agriculture look primitive. He's not being lectured. He's simply experiencing a different reality. He sees a farmer, his boss, working alongside him, treating him with a degree of respect. This wasn't the arrogant, weak-willed enemy he was told about. This was just a man working his land with incredible tools. This everyday reality was far more powerful than any formal re-education program. The Americans tried some of those, of course. They showed films and held lectures about democracy and the American system. But for the most part, these were met with cynicism and ridicule. The prisoners saw it for what it was. Counter-propaganda, but you can't argue with a full stomach. You can't propagandize away the taste of real coffee. You can't dismiss the sight of a well-stocked library, where prisoners could read anything from German classics to American magazines, including publications that were critical of the American government itself. The very existence of a free press was a shocking concept. In Germany, the only news was stat-approved news. Here, they could read articles that criticized President Roosevelt. The idea that a country could be strong enough to tolerate internal dissent was completely alien. The division in the camps grew deeper. The hardliners became more aggressive, trying to maintain their grip. Fights would break out over a copy of an American magazine, or when someone spoke too favorably about the camp conditions. But their power was eroding, slowly, day by day. Their threats seemed less potent when contrasted with the simple, undeniable reality of a well-run system. The most profound change came from the work programs. Many prisoners were sent to work on farms, in forests, and in canneries, to help with the labor shortage in America. Out in the real world, they interacted with ordinary Americans. They saw women driving cars and managing businesses. They saw different races working, sometimes side by side. It wasn't perfect, and America certainly had its own deep-seated problems and prejudices, but it was a far cry from the caricature of racial chaos painted by Google. They saw a society that, for all its flaws, was fundamentally abundant and functional. Doubt began to spread like a quiet infection. It wasn't a sudden conversion. It was a slow, creeping realization that they had been lied to. Not just lied to a little bit, but lied to on a fundamental, world-altering scale. The system they had fought and bled for was built on a foundation of falsehoods, and the proof was all around them. And the food they ate, the tools they used, and the society they observed. The propaganda was meeting reality, and reality was winning. This quiet, internal struggle within the POW camps was one of the most interesting and overlooked fronts of World War II. It showed that sometimes the most effective way to challenge a destructive ideology isn't with lectures or force, but with the simple, undeniable evidence of a better way to live. Imagine you're a German soldier, just captured on the battlefield. You've been told your whole life that America is a land of poverty, chaos, and crime, a place teetering on the brink of collapse. You're exhausted, defeated, and preparing for the worst as you're herded onto a train. But what you find inside isn't a cattle car. It's a Pullman coach. The seats are plush, the windows are clean, and an American conductor, not a guard, politely shows you to your seat. This wasn't a punishment. This was a journey. And it was a journey that would change everything for thousands of German posts during World War II. This is the story of the luxurious train rides, a chapter of the war that feels almost unbelievable. Between 1943 and 1945, hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers were transported across the United States to prison camps, but their transit was unlike anything they could have imagined. Instead of brutality, they found a strange kind of hospitality. They were served hot meals, sometimes even coffee and donuts, by smiling American volunteers at train stops. It was baffling. Weren't these the enemy? Weren't they supposed to be hated? The real shock, however, came from what they saw outside their windows. The train rolled on for days, passing through the American heartland. For mile after endless mile, They saw not poverty, but abundance. They saw vast farmlands stretching to the horizon, bursting with crops. They saw massive factories, smokestacks puffing away, a clear sign of immense industrial power. They saw towns and cities full of cars, bustling with people who seemed well-fed and well-dressed. This was not the America they had been told about. Think about it from their perspective. A young German soldier, raised on propaganda films showing American breadlines and slums, is now witnessing a country that seems impossibly rich and productive. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming. One former POW later recalled thinking that if this was the country they were fighting, the war was already lost. The train ride itself became a powerful, silent form of propaganda. No lecture on the virtues of democracy could ever be as convincing as the sight of a nation so obviously thriving, even in the midst of a global war. These men saw more of America than many Americans ever would. They traveled from the East Coast, through the plains of the Midwest, to the deserts of the Southwest. They saw the diversity of the American landscape and, more importantly, the unified strength behind it. The journey east to west was a continuous display of power. One train would pass, and soon after, another train heading in the opposite direction would thunder by, loaded with tanks, jeeps, and artillery, all heading for the front lines in Europe. The message was clear and undeniable. America's capacity to produce and transport was limitless. This experience planted a seed of doubt. If their leaders had lied about America, what else had they lied about? The clean Pullman cars and the endless fields of corn weren't just a comfortable ride. They were a direct challenge to the entire ideology they had fought for. They were seeing a different world, one where the enemy treated them with a level of decency they never expected, and where the society they were meant to despise was stronger and more prosperous than they could have dreamed. At the camps, this soft power re-education continued. Many posts were put to work on local farms or in factories, working alongside American civilians. They earned a small wage, which they could spend at the camp canteen on things like Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and magazines. They saw American life up close, not as enemies, but as temporary neighbors. They interacted with farmers, factory workers, and guards who, more often than not, treated them with respect. This human connection further chipped away at the wall of propaganda. They were no longer the faceless enemy, and Americans were no longer the cartoon villains from their new. Of course, not every experience was perfect. Tensions existed, and the reality of being a prisoner was always present. But the overwhelming narrative that emerges from the accounts of these men is one of astonishment. The journey across America was more than just transportation. It was a rolling classroom, a mobile exhibition of a world they didn't know existed. It subtly taught them about a different way of life, not through force or indoctrination, but simply by showing them the truth. When the war ended and these men were eventually sent back to a Germany that was in ruins, they carried this experience with them. They had seen a vision of prosperity and freedom that would influence their own efforts to rebuild their nation. Many developed a lifelong affection for America, the country that had defeated them, but also shown them an unexpected kindness. The luxurious train rides of World War II were a forgotten method, proving that sometimes the most effective way to win hearts and minds isn't with a weapon, but with a window seat. It's a powerful reminder that our perception of the world can be completely transformed, all from the simple act of looking out a train window. Imagine being a soldier, deep in the chaos of World War II. You've fought, you've seen things you can never unsee, and then you're captured. You're a prisoner of war. What do you expect? Brutality, starvation, the worst of humanity. For many German soldiers captured by the Allies, especially the Americans, what they found was something entirely different, something that would fundamentally challenge everything they'd been taught. This is the story of the human touch, a chapter of the war often left in the shadows. The year is 1944. The tide of the war is turning. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers are now prisoners, shipped across the Atlantic to camps scattered across the United States. From the farmlands of the Midwest to the cotton fields of the South, these men, raised under a regime that preached hatred and the absolute authority of the state, were bracing for the worst. They expected their captors to be mirror images of their own cruelest guard sadists who reveled in power. But what they encountered was profoundly disorienting. The guards weren't hardened SS officers. They were citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and factory workers from Ohio, Texas, and California. Men who, just a few months earlier, were living ordinary lives. They weren't trained in the arts of cruelty. They were trained to uphold a code of conduct, a code enshrined in a document many of the German prisoners had never even heard of. The Geneva Convention, and the Americans took it seriously. Meticulously. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed, given clean clothes, and provided with medical care. The food was not just sustenance. It was often better than what they had received as soldiers in the dwindling German army. They were given rations equivalent to those of the American soldiers guarding them. Think about that for a moment. An enemy soldier, by law, was entitled to the same amount of food as his American counterpart. This was a completely alien concept, but the rules and regulations were only one part of the story. The real transformation, the real human touch, came from the small, unscripted moments of kindness. It happened in the quiet interactions between guard and prisoner. An American guard, maybe a young man from a farm in Iowa, sees a German prisoner, a boy of similar age, shivering in the cold. He doesn't see a monster. He sees another young man far from home, and he slips him a cigarette. A simple, forbidden gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It said, "I see you. I see your humanity." These acts weren't isolated incidents. They happened all over the country. There are countless documented stories. A guard who spoke a little German would help a prisoner write a letter home to his family, letting them know he was alive. Can you imagine the relief that single letter would bring? In a world torn apart by war, a small act of translation bridged an enormous divide. It was a lifeline. Christmas of 1944 was particularly poignant. In money camps, local communities and churches reached out. They organized special dinners for the prisoners. German POWs, who expected to spend the holiday in misery, found themselves sitting down to a Christmas meal, sometimes with decorations and carols. Some American guards even shared treats from their own families' carry packages. For these German soldiers, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about the heartless, materialistic Americans, this was a culture shock of the highest order. This kindness wasn't just about charity, it was also about work. Many prisoners were put to work on local farms and in factories to help with the wartime labor shortage. Here, they worked side by side with American civilians. They shared lunch breaks with farmers, talked about crops, the weather, and family. They learned about a different way of life. They saw families who weren't living in constant fear of the state. They saw people who could disagree with their government and not be arrested. A farmer in Georgia might invite a group of prisoners working his fields for a glass of lemonade on a hot day. His wife might bring out a freshly baked pie. These weren't orders from a commanding officer. This was just people being people. The prisoners weren't just numbers anymore. Hans, who was good with machinery, or Klaus, who missed his mother's cooking. And the Americans weren't just the enemy. They were Mr. Henderson, who told bad jokes, or Mrs. Gable, whose son was fighting in the Pacific. This consistent, humane treatment had a profound psychological effect. The Nazi regime was built on a foundation of fear and absolute, unquestioning obedience. Power was demonstrated through intimidation and brutality. You obeyed because you were terrified of the consequences. If you didn't. But in these American camps, the German soldiers saw a different kind of authority. The guards didn't need to scream or use force to maintain order. The camp ran efficiently, not because the prisoners were afraid of being beaten, but because they were treated with a baseline of decency. They were given a structure, rules, and responsibilities, and in return, their dignity was respected. This was a system that commanded obedience, not through fear, but through something far more powerful: respect. For the first time, many of these soldiers were seeing an enemy that didn't fit the monstrous caricature they'd been shown their whole lives. They were witnessing a society that, even in the midst of a brutal war, adhered to a moral code. A society that believed in the rule of law and the inherent worth of an individual, even an enemy individual. This experience planted a seed of doubt. If the Americans, the supposed enemy, could be this decent, what else had their leaders lied to them about? It was a quiet, personal rebellion happening in the minds of thousands of men. The propaganda was crumbling, not under the force of bombs, but under the weight of countless small acts of kindness. A shared cigarette, a translated letter, a slice of Christmas cake. Of course, not every interaction was perfect. There were tensions, and the realities of war were never far away. But the overwhelming narrative that emerges from the diaries and letters of these German POWs is one of surprise, and eventually, a grudging respect. They saw a strength in American democracy that wasn't about military might, but about its underlying values. This human touch was, in its own way, a powerful weapon. It wasn't designed to win a battle, but it helped to win the peace that followed. Many of these prisoners returned to a devastated Germany after the war, but they carried with them a memory of a different world. They became ambassadors, not for America, but for the idea that enemies could treat each other with humanity. They were instrumental in rebuilding their nation, helping to foster a new Germany on the principles of democracy and respect they had unexpectedly witnessed firsthand in the heart of their enemy's homeland. The story of these POW camps is a vital reminder. It shows that even in the darkest of times, compassion can be a revolutionary act. It teaches us that obedience earned through respect is stronger and more enduring than obedience coerced by fear. It's a testament to the simple, profound power of the human touch. Imagine being a soldier, captured and sent across an ocean to your enemy's homeland. You expect to find a perfect, unified nation, the one from the propaganda films. But what you discover is something far more complex, far more human. This was the reality for thousands of German prisoners of war held in America between 1944 and 1945. They arrived with a certain image of the United States, an image of a flawless democracy. What they found was a land of staggering contradictions. They were put to work on farms and in factories across the country, from the Deep South to the Midwest. And as they lived and worked alongside Americans, their eyes were opened. They saw things that simply didn't fit the perfect picture. They saw racial segregation, a society divided by color. In the morning, they might work side by side with black Americans in the fields, sharing a joke or a moment of rest. But come evening, they saw how those same co-workers were forced into separate, unequal lives. The German prisoners, the supposed enemies, often had more freedom of movement in town than the black citizens who were fighting for the very country that segregated them. This was a profound shock. In their letters home, many POWs described this enforced separation. They saw the whites-only signs, the separate water fountains, the back of the bus seating. It was a jarring reality, a system of caste that seemed utterly at odds with the American ideals of liberty and equality they'd heard so much about. For men raised in a society that preached racial purity, seeing this different, yet equally rigid, form of racial hierarchy was deeply confusing. It didn't make sense. America was fighting a war against a regime built on racial hatred, yet it practiced its own form of racial discrimination at home. And it wasn't just the daily, grinding reality of segregation. The prisoners also read American newspapers. They were often given access to local and national news, a privilege unheard of in German POW camps. And in those papers, they read the headlines. They read about lynchings, horrific acts of racial terror, reported in black and white. For these German soldiers, who had been part of a brutal war machine, the idea of a society allowing such violence against its own citizens during peacetime was bewildering. It was proof, undeniable proof, that this great American democracy was deeply, deeply flawed. They saw the vast economic inequality. Some Americans lived in sprawling mansions, while others, particularly in rural areas where many camps were located, lived in poverty that rivaled anything they had seen in war-torn Europe. The land of opportunity was also a land of immense disparity. All these things, the segregation, the violence, the inequality, chipped away at the myth of a perfect America. It was, in their eyes, a nation that preached one thing and practiced another. Paradox. But here is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because they didn't just see the flaws, they saw the response to those flaws. And this is what truly captivated them. Yes, they read headlines about lynchings. But in the very same newspapers, they read editorials, fiercely condemning those acts. They read articles by journalists who risked their careers and sometimes their lives, to expose injustice. They heard Americans on the street, their own guards, their employers on the farms, openly criticizing the government's policies. Think about that for a moment. These German soldiers came from a totalitarian state, the Third Reich, where a single dissenting word against the government, against Hitler, could mean a death sentence. Public criticism was unthinkable. The press was a state-controlled mouthpiece. The people lived in a constant state of fear, where even a private conversation could be reported by a neighbor or a family member. Their entire reality was built on the foundation of absolute obedience and the suppression of all dissent. And now, here they were, in the heart of their enemy's country, witnessing the complete opposite. They saw people free to stand up and say, "This is wrong." They saw citizens organizing, protesting, and demanding change. They saw a political system where the opposition party could openly challenge the president. They listened to radio programs where commentators debated every aspect of the war effort and domestic policy, often in scathing terms. This was, for many of them, a revelation. It was the other side of the American contradiction. The country was flawed, yes, but it wasn't trying to hide its flaws. In fact, it seemed to be constantly arguing about them, wrestling with them out in the open. The German Post saw a society that not only tolerated dissent, but, in many ways, was built upon it. The freedom to criticize, to point out the hypocrisy, to work for a better future. This was as much a part of America as the injustices they witnessed. This paradox became a subject of endless fascination and debate in the barracks of the POW camps. How could a country so divided, so full of problems, be so strong? Their own system, the Nazi system, had promised strength through unity, through the elimination of all opposition. It demanded a single, unquestioning national will. And yet, that system was now crumbling. America, on the other hand, seemed to draw a strange kind of strength from its own internal conflicts. They began to understand that democracy wasn't about being perfect. It was about the process of striving for perfection. It was about having the mechanisms in place to correct its own mistakes. The freedom of the press, the right to assemble, the ability to vote a leader out of office, these weren't signs of weakness, as they had been taught. They were the essential tools of a self-correcting system. This concept was revolutionary. It suggested that a nation's true strength didn't come from silencing its critics, but from listening to them. It came from acknowledging its failures and allowing its people the freedom to fix them. The German Posts were watching, in real time, the messy, chaotic, and often ugly process of a democracy at work. It was a system that could look weak and fractured from the outside, but which possessed a deep, resilient strength because it wasn't brittle. It could bend without breaking. It could evolve. For some of these prisoners, this experience planted a seed. They had seen firsthand that a dictatorship, with its demand for absolute conformity, was ultimately weaker than a noisy, argumentative, and imperfect democracy. They witnessed a country that was strong enough to admit it was wrong and brave enough to let its people fight for what was right. They saw that the struggle itself, the constant debate and push for change, was the very engine of a free society. When these men were eventually repatriated to a defeated and devastated Germany, they carried this memory with them, the memory of America's great contradiction. A nation deeply flawed, yet endlessly striving, a place where the freedom to dissent made it, paradoxically, stronger and more resilient than the totalitarianism they had once served. It was a lesson learned not in a classroom, but in the cotton fields and factory floors of their enemy. A lesson that would help shape their understanding of the world for the rest of their lives. Picture this. It's 1944. World War II is raging, but deep within the United States, a very different kind of battle is being waged. A battle for the mind. Inside the barbed wire fences of over 500 prisoner of war camps, something extraordinary is happening. American authorities have quietly launched one of the most ambitious re-education programs in history, targeting hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers. This wasn't about punishment. It was about planting a seed. The seed of democracy. So, how did they do it? Forget harsh interrogations. Instead, think movie nights and college lectures. The Americans set up a secret operation, a special projects division, with a mission to denazify these men. They began by carefully screening the prisoners, separating the die-hard fanatics from the rest. For the majority, a unique curriculum was designed. They were shown films, not just any films, but Hollywood productions that showcased the American way of life, its freedoms, and its diversity. Think Frank Capra films, documentaries about the Tennessee Valley Authority, and even newsreels depicting the horrors of the concentration camps, which were just beginning to be liberated. The goal was subtle, but powerful. To expose the lies of the Nazi propaganda machine, these prisoners, who had been fed a steady diet of hate and superiority, were now seeing a different reality. They saw a country where different people could live together, where a farmer could become prosperous through hard work, and where individual liberty was celebrated. The films were just the beginning. The program also brought in German-speaking professors, many of whom had fled Nazi Germany themselves. They gave lectures on American history, the principles of democracy, free enterprise, and even English literature. Imagine being a young German soldier, raised to believe in the absolute power of the state and the Suddenly, you're sitting in a makeshift classroom in Arizona or Texas, learning about the Declaration of Independence, about checks and balances, and the rights of the individual. You're reading books by authors like Thomas Mann, whose work was burned back home. For many, this was a profound shock. The program published its own German-language newspaper, Der Ruf, or The Call. It was filled with articles about world events, German culture, and democratic ideals, all written by anti-Nazi prisoners themselves. This newspaper became a vital tool, creating a space for open discussion and critical thinking that was unthinkable under Hitler's regime. Of course, not everyone was converted overnight. There were still ardent Nazis who resisted, who clung to their ideology. They would heckle speakers, try to intimidate their fellow prisoners, and dismiss the whole thing as American propaganda. The camp authorities had to be constantly vigilant, protecting the participants and weeding out the troublemakers. But for a significant number of these men, the lessons started to stick. What they were learning in the classrooms confirmed what they were already seeing with their own eyes. They saw American guards who, for the most part, treated them humanely. They worked on local farms and were paid for their labor, interacting with ordinary American families who didn't fit the monstrous caricatures painted by Goebbels. This experience on the farms was a crucial part of their They saw firsthand the productivity and wealth of a free market system. They saw farmers who owned their own land, drove their own cars, and lived in comfortable homes. This was a stark contrast to the war-torn, centrally controlled economy they had left behind. The combination of formal education and real-world observation began to chip away at the foundation of their beliefs. The ideology that had promised them a 1,000-year Reich was revealed to be a structure built on a mountain of lies. They realized that their leaders had deceived them, leading their country and its people to ruin. One of the most powerful moments for many prisoners came when they were shown a film called Toads or Death Mills. This was one of the first documentaries compiled from footage taken by Allied forces as they liberated the concentration camps. The prisoners were confronted with the undeniable, graphic evidence of the atrocities committed in their name. The silence in the screening rooms was deafening. For many, this was the point of no return. The abstract ideas of Nazi evil became a concrete, horrifying reality. It wasn't just a political disagreement anymore. It was a mortal reckoning. As the war ended in 1945, the re-education program entered its final, most critical phase. The Allies knew that simply sending these men back to a devastated Germany wasn't enough. They needed to return as apostles of a new way of thinking. A special school was set up at Fort Eustis, Virginia, for the most promising candidates. These hand-picked prisoners received intensive training in democratic administration, journalism, and education. They were being prepared to become the leaders, the teachers, and the builders of a new, democratic Germany. They were the hope for a future free from the tyranny that had consumed their past. When these men were finally repatriated, they carried more than just their meager belongings. They carried the ideas and the hope they had discovered in the most unlikely of places, an American POW camp. Many of them went on to play significant roles in the post-war reconstruction of West Germany. They became politicians, journalists, union leaders, and educators. The newspaper they started in the camp, Der Ruf, was re-established in Germany and became an influential voice for a new generation of German intellectuals. This quiet, almost forgotten chapter of World War II is a powerful testament to the idea that education can be more powerful than weapons. It shows that even in the darkest of times, the human desire for truth and freedom can be reached. The education of captives wasn't just about changing minds. It was about rebuilding a nation from the inside out, proving that a better future was not just a dream, but a real possibility. Imagine this. The war is over. The fighting has stopped. For millions of German soldiers held as prisoners of war in America, this should be a moment of pure joy. They're finally going home. But what kind of home are they returning to? This is the story of their journey back, not just across an ocean, but into a future no one could have predicted. The year is 1945. As the last postboard ships leaving American shores, they carry more than just their meager belongings. They carry memories. Memories of a land that was their enemy, but also a land that showed them something incredible. They saw sprawling farms bursting with food, factories humming with productivity, and a society where people could, for the most part, speak their minds without fear. They worked on American farms, ate American food, and saw firsthand a system built on democratic principles. For men who had only known the rigid, oppressive structure of the Third Reich, this was a revelation. But as their ships approached the European coast, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The first glimpse of Germany was a shock. Hamburg, Bremerhaven, Le Havre, these, once mighty ports, were now ghost cities. Skeletons of buildings clawed at the sky. Entire city blocks had been flattened, reduced to mountains of rubble and twisted steel. This was the stunned null, the 0 hour. Everything was gone. Disembarking from the ships, the returning soldiers stepped into a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The vibrant cities they remembered were gone, replaced by a monochrome landscape of gray ruins. People moved like ghosts through the streets, their faces etched with hunger and despair. The so-called fraternization ban was still in effect, meaning Allied soldiers were forbidden from speaking to German civilians. This created a strange, silent world where the victors and the vanquished existed side by side but worlds apart. For the returning POWs, the journey home was a brutal lesson in loss. They traveled in open cattle cars, exposed to the biting cold, with little food or water. The trains crawled through the devastated countryside, a slow-motion tour of their nation's defeat. They passed bombed-out bridges, factories that were now just empty shells, and endless fields of rubble where homes once stood. This was the Germany they had fought for, a wasteland. The psychological toll was immense. They were coming home, but what was home? Their houses were often gone. Their families were scattered, missing, or worse. One soldier, Heinz, finally made it back to his hometown of Dresden. He found the address where his family once lived, but there was nothing there. Just a crater. He spent weeks searching through refugee lists and makeshift hospitals, his hope dwindling with each passing day. His story was one of thousands. The joy of survival was quickly overshadowed by the crushing weight of what had been lost. And then there was the hunger. The winter of 1946 became known as the Hunger Winter. Rations were minuscule, barely enough to sustain life. People were eating bread made from sawdust and foraging for nettles and roots in the bombed-out parks. The men returning from America, who had become accustomed to 3 meals a day in the POW camps, was suddenly thrust into a world of starvation. The irony was bitter. In the enemy's land, they were fed. In their homeland, they starved. This period was also one of deep moral confusion. The full horror of the concentration camps was being revealed to the German public. For many soldiers, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, this was a moment of sickening realization. They had been part of a monstrous machine. The guilt was collective and personal. How could this have happened? How could they not have known? This internal reckoning was, for many, as difficult as the physical hardship. Yet, amidst this utter devastation, something unexpected began to take root. The men who returned from the American camps carried a secret weapon. It wasn't a physical tool, but an idea, a blueprint for a different kind of society. They had seen with their own eyes that a country could be powerful without being oppressive. They had witnessed the incredible productivity of American industry and agriculture. They had experienced a system where individual initiative was rewarded and where basic fairness, even to prisoners, was a guiding principle. These men became known as the Americana in their communities. They stood out. While others were paralyzed by despair, they started clearing rubble. They organized work crews. They used the practical skills they learned in the U.S. how to operate machinery, modern farming techniques, efficient construction methods to begin the monumental task of rebuilding. A former officer who had been a POW in Texas returned to his village and was shocked by the apathy. The local farmers were still using old, inefficient methods. He remembered the vast, mechanized farms he had worked on in America. He gathered the village elders and, using his memories and a few smuggled-in pamphlets, explained the principles of crop rotation and soil management he'd learned. At first, they were skeptical. But with nothing to lose, they tried, and slowly, yields began to improve. It wasn't just about technical skills, it was a change in mindset. These men brought back a belief in democratic processes. In towns and villages, they were the ones arguing for establishing new local councils based on open debate, not top-down authority. They had seen town hall meetings in America, and they tried to replicate that spirit of civic engagement. They advocated for a free press and freedom of speech, concepts that had been alien for over a decade. They had learned English in the camps and now acted as informal translators and mediators with the Allied occupation forces, helping to bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered. One of the most powerful things they brought back was a sense of pragmatism and a can-do attitude. America had shown them that problems could be solved through ingenuity and hard work. So when a bridge was out, they didn't just wait for the authorities. They organized teams to build a temporary crossing. When a school was needed, they salvaged materials from the ruins and built it themselves. They were planting the seeds of what would become the German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. This transformation wasn't easy or immediate. These Amerikaner were often met with suspicion. Some saw them as tainted by the enemy, as no longer true Germans. But their results spoke for themselves. The communities where they were influential tended to recover faster. Their forward-looking optimism was a powerful antidote to the prevailing despair. The story of these returning posts is a crucial, often overlooked, chapter in the story of post-war Germany. They went to war as soldiers of the Third Reich and returned as unintentional students of democracy. They left a homeland built on ideology and returned to ruble, but they carried in their minds a blueprint for a new Germany, one built not on conquest and racial purity, but on productivity, fairness, and freedom of thought. World War II, a conflict that scarred the globe, holds countless stories of heroism, tragedy, and immense suffering. But hidden within this vast, dark chapter is a story that defies expectation. It's a tale not of battlefield glory, but of unquiet, unlikely victory won. That unfolded not in the trenches of Europe, but on the farms and in the factories of America. This is the story of the German prisoner of war program, one of history's most astonishing and overlooked success stories. By 1945, nearly 400,000 German soldiers found themselves on American soil, not as invaders, but as prisoners. Shipped across the Atlantic, these men, who had fought under the banner of the Third Reich, expected the worst. They were prepared for brutality, for starvation, for the same cruelty their own regime had inflicted upon others. What they found instead would change many of them forever. Instead of concertina wire and cruelty, they found something radically different. From the fields of Georgia to the forests of Minnesota, these prisoners were put to work. They harvested crops, cut timber, and worked in canneries, filling the massive labor shortage left by American men fighting overseas. And for their work, they were paid. It was a nominal fee, just 80 cents a day in scrip they could use at the camp canteen. But the principle was revolutionary. They were being treated not just as prisoners, but as laborers. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. The American government, bound by the Geneva Convention, decided to go a step further. They saw an opportunity not just to house enemy combatants, but to win a different kind of war. A war for hearts and minds. The program was designed to be a living, breathing demonstration of the very ideals America was fighting for. Think about the psychological impact. A young German soldier, raised on a diet of propaganda that depicted Americans as degenerate, greedy capitalists, suddenly finds himself treated with a measure of dignity. He works alongside American farmers who, despite having sons and brothers fighting the German army, might share a cup of coffee with him. He sees a society that, even in the midst of a total war, operates on principles of fairness and reward for labor. At camps like Fort Hunt, Virginia, a secret program was underway. Here, carefully selected German prisoners were engaged in conversations, not interrogations. American intelligence officers, many of them German-born Jews who had fled the Nazis, sat down with these men. They talked about democracy, about freedom of speech, about the world that existed outside the propaganda bubble of the Third Reich. They weren't trying to break them. They were trying to educate them. These re-education efforts were subtle but powerful. Prisoners were given access to libraries stocked with books that had been burned in Germany. They could watch American movies, listen to American music, and even take courses on subjects like American history and English. For the first time, many of these men were being exposed to uncensored information, to a different way of thinking. They were being shown, not who's told what democracy looked like. Of course, not every prisoner was converted. Many remained loyal Nazis until the very end, but for a significant number, the experience was transformative. They saw a nation where people from different backgrounds could argue, debate, and still live together. They saw a system where hard work was rewarded and where individual rights were, for the most part, respected. It was a stark contrast to the rigid, fear-based hierarchy they had known. The stories from this time are incredible. There are accounts of prisoners forming lifelong friendships with the American families they worked for. In some small towns, the German POWs became a part of the community. They played soccer against local teams, performed in theater groups, and shared meals with their supposed enemies. One prisoner in Iowa, a talented artist, spent his time painting murals in a local church, murals that are still there today. When the war ended and it was time for repatriation, many didn't want to leave. They had seen a different world, and it had planted a seed. But they were sent back to a Germany that was physically and morally shattered. And it was here that the true legacy of the POW program began to bloom. These returning soldiers became ambassadors for a different future. They had first-hand experience of a democratic society that worked. They had been treated with humanity by their captors. In the monumental task of rebuilding Germany from the ashes of Nazism, their perspective was invaluable. They could speak with authority, not from propaganda, but from personal experience. They could tell their countrymen, "I have seen it. Freedom is not a weakness. It is a strength." Even today, the ripple effects of this program are felt. The descendants of these prisoners, both in Germany and in America, tell stories passed down through generations. They are stories of gratitude, of respect, and of unexpected kindness in the darkest of times. They speak of the American farmer who shared his family's dinner, or the camp guard who treated them with fairness. These aren't just feel-good anecdotes. They represent a profound truth. America won this particular battle, not through force, but through its example. It demonstrated that the values of freedom, industry, and basic human decency were more powerful and more resilient than any ideology of hate and tyranny. This chapter of history teaches us that the greatest victories are rarely the ones won with bombs and bullets. They are the victories that happen quietly, in the minds and hearts of individuals. It's the moment a person sees their enemy not as a monster, but as a fellow human being. The German POW program in America is a testament to this idea. It's proof that sometimes the most effective weapon is compassion, and the most lasting triumph is a change of heart.